The Hefner dynasty was the self-proclaimed royal family of the 20th century sexual revolution. Rising from a cramped Chicago kitchen in 1953, they forged a multi-billion-dollar media empire that defined the ultimate American fantasy. For decades, the name Hefner commanded absolute authority. While the father reigned as the high priest of the mansion, the daughter operated the corporate machine, fueling a lifestyle of private jets, celebrity power, and endless excess. Far from a legacy of liberation, the dynasty's true inheritance was confinement. Behind the iron gates lay a velvet prison, and the Hefner empire operated as a machine that consumed women, lubricated by drugs, hidden cameras, and covered-up deaths. How many tears were hidden behind the glossy magazine covers? This is the forensic autopsy of a kingdom built on rot. From a loveless childhood to the exploitation of Marilyn Monroe, the pathology of the Playboy empire did not begin amidst the grottos and velvet of Los Angeles. It incubated in a brick bungalow in Chicago during the austere years of the 1920s. Hugh Marston Hefner, born on April 9, 1926, was the product of an environment that modern child psychologists would classify as a state of emotional malnutrition. His parents, Glenn and Grace Hefner, were devout Methodists who adhered to a rigid moral code where virtue was synonymous with repression. In the Hefner household, affection was not a currency of exchange. There were no spontaneous hugs, no verbal affirmations of love, and no physical contact. Hefner grew up in a sterile vacuum, later admitting that he could not recall a single instance of his mother holding him. This absence of tactile comfort represented more than a minor detail of his upbringing. It served as the structural failure that would define his entire adult existence. The void left by the missing affection created a profound cavern of insecurity, a hunger for validation and control that he would later attempt to satiate with a harem of thousands, yet never truly fill. The repression in the Hefner home extended beyond the withholding of affection. It was a systematic erasure of the human condition. Discussion of the body, of biological functions, or of sexuality was treated with the severity of a capital crime. The young Hugh Hefner, trapped in this hermetically sealed jar of puritanical judgment, reacted with a classic defense mechanism: retreat. He withdrew into a private world of pulp fiction, monster movies, and comic books. In these pages, the world was vibrant, women were compliant, and the hero was always in command. It was here, in the isolation of his bedroom, that the blueprint for the Playboy mansion was drafted. He learned early on that the real world was cold, unpredictable, and withholding, while the world of fantasy was safe, warm, and controllable. Rather than an act of liberation, this retreat functioned as a desperate measure of self-protection by a victim. He resolved to rewrite the script of his life, not to find equality with others, but to establish a domain where he was the absolute arbiter of value. By 1952, at the age of 26, Hefner appeared to be failing at escaping his parents' orbit. He was married, a father, and working a stagnant job as a copywriter for Esquire magazine in Chicago. He was living precisely the life his parents had designed for him: modest, repressed, and anonymous. The catalyst for the explosion came when Esquire announced a relocation to New York. Hefner demanded a $5 raise to cover the cost of the move. The management refused. That denial was the spark that ignited 26 years of compressed frustration. Hefner quit. He decided to gamble his entire existence on a frantic, improbable venture, a magazine for men that would challenge the hypocrisy he despised. However, the financial forensics of this startup reveal a portrait of desperation rather than the calculated vision of a tycoon. Hefner possessed no capital, no credit history, and no business experience. He pawned his typewriter. He borrowed money against his meager furniture. He scraped together loans from friends. In a twist of irony that serves as the psychological key to the entire saga, the primary investor in this venture of sexual liberation was Grace Hefner, the very mother who had withheld her touch and enforced the puritanical rules. She wrote her son a check for $1,000. She explicitly stated that she did not believe in the magazine, but she believed in her son. This transaction is the foundational paradox of the empire. The woman who refused to hug her child funded the machine that would objectify women for the next half-century. With a total of $8,000, Hefner began operations from a card table in his kitchen. He was so terrified of failure, so convinced of his own inadequacy, that the first issue of the magazine did not even carry a date on the cover. He did not believe there would be a second issue. To survive, he needed a weapon. He needed something that would shatter the gray conformity of Eisenhower's America. He needed a body. The acquisition of Marilyn Monroe's image stood as a predatory act rather than a collaboration, constituting the original sin of the Playboy dynasty. In 1953, Marilyn Monroe was ascending to Hollywood superstardom, but her history was littered with the debris of poverty. 4 years prior, in 1949, as a struggling unknown named Norma Jean Baker, she had faced destitution. With her car impounded and no money for rent, she agreed to pose unclothed for a calendar photographer named Tom Kelly for a flat fee of $50. She signed the release under the alias Mona Monroe, terrified that the images would destroy her acting prospects. She did it for survival, not for exhibitionism. Hefner, operating with the cold instinct of a scavenger, discovered the existence of these photos. He did not see a woman in distress. He saw an undervalued asset. He tracked down the calendar company that held the rights and purchased the images for $500. The power dynamic revealed a stark truth. Hugh Hefner never met Marilyn Monroe. He never spoke to her. He never requested her consent. He never offered her a contract. He simply purchased a piece of paper that transferred ownership of her private image from one man to another. In December 1953, the first issue of Playboy hit the stands. The cover featured a fully clothed, smiling Marilyn. But in the center, where Hefner coined the term centerfold, lay the nude image of her on red velvet. The magazine sold over 50,000 copies almost instantly. Hugh Hefner became a millionaire overnight. The $500 investment yielded an infinite return, launching an empire that would span generations. For Marilyn, however, it was a catastrophe. The exposure threatened to end her career before it truly began. She was humiliated, forced to publicly apologize to studio heads, and compelled to explain her poverty to a judging public. While Hefner was toasted as a genius and a revolutionary, his first playmate was fighting for her professional life. She received zero royalties from the millions Hefner made. This event established the core business model of Playboy. Identify young, beautiful, vulnerable women, monetize their bodies for the consumption of men, and discard them while keeping the profits. Hefner treated Marilyn Monroe less as a muse and more as the stepping stone he used to climb out of mediocrity. Flush with cash and emboldened by success, Hefner began to construct a philosophy to justify his exploitation. He authored the Playboy philosophy, a sprawling serialized manifesto that ran for thousands of words. He wrapped his explicit material in the language of sophisticated rebellion, arguing that he was fighting against the anti-sexual hypocrisy of the church and state. He claimed Playboy was about lifestyle, about jazz, literature, and intellectual discourse. However, the visual language of the magazine revealed a darker reality. The lifestyle was the camouflage. The woman was the product. Hefner engineered the concept of the girl next door. Unlike the gritty underground pornography of the era, Playboy presented a sanitized, airbrushed version of female sexuality. Imperfections were erased. Stretch marks, scars, and pores were removed. The women were presented as dolls, plasticized, perfected, and passive. This was Hefner projecting his childhood trauma onto the canvas of American culture. He did not want real women with complex emotional needs, biological realities, or demands for intimacy. He wanted static images. He wanted the safety of a fantasy where the woman is always smiling, always available, and never speaks. He was building a two-dimensional world because the three-dimensional one had hurt him. The institutionalization of this control accelerated in the 1960s with the opening of the Playboy clubs. The women who worked there, the bunnies, were subjected to a regime of body fascism detailed in the Bunny Manual. This document dictated every aspect of their existence, from the specific bunny dip required to serve drinks without exposing too much, to rigid weight requirements. A bunny was weighed like a prizefighter or livestock. Any gain was met with suspension. It was a military-grade control system disguised as glamorous employment. Instead of liberating women, Hefner had simply packaged them as high-end consumer goods, standardized and mass-produced for men who were as lonely and repressed as he was. The ultimate evidence of Hefner's psychological deformation and the final insult to his first victim occurred decades later, in 1992. Despite having bedded thousands of women and built a harem of girlfriends, Hefner maintained a unilateral necrophilic obsession with Marilyn Monroe. He frequently referred to her as his spiritual partner, claiming a bond that existed only in his mind. In a move that provoked deep revulsion among those who understood the history, Hefner paid $75,000 to purchase the crypt immediately to the left of Marilyn Monroe at the Westwood Village Memorial Park Cemetery in Los Angeles. This purchase cannot be viewed as a romantic gesture. Marilyn Monroe died in 1962, a tragic figure consumed by the industry that used her. She had no relationship with Hefner. By buying the plot next to her, Hefner was committing the ultimate act of a stalker. He was asserting ownership over her for eternity. He ensured that in death, he would lie beside the woman whose exploitation founded his fortune. It was a final, non-consensual assertion of dominance. He framed it as sleeping with the ultimate blonde. But forensically, it was a predator returning to the scene of the crime to permanently attach himself to the victim. It symbolized the entirety of the Playboy ethos. The woman has no voice, no choice, and no escape even in the grave. By the end of the 1960s, Hugh Hefner had completed his metamorphosis. The repressed boy from Chicago had become the emperor of pleasure. He owned the Big Bunny jet, painted black and equipped with a disco. He owned the mansions. He owned the cultural narrative. He had escaped the Methodist cage, but he had not found freedom. He had simply constructed a larger, more expensive cage where he held the keys. The foundation of the empire was now set, but it was built on a fault line of misogyny and exploitation. As the 1970s approached, bringing with them a darker wave of drug culture and excess, the structural integrity of the Playboy fantasy would begin to buckle. The control Hefner desperately exerted was about to slip, and the girl next door was about to become a casualty of war in the Velvet Prison. Marilyn Monroe was merely the first ghost in a mansion that would soon be crowded with them. What really happened? Behind the gates of the mansion, the geography of the Playboy empire underwent a seismic shift in 1971. a migration that was not merely physical, but atmospheric. Abandoning the chilly, jazz-inflected sophistication of Chicago, Hugh Hefner moved his court to the Holmby Hills of Los Angeles, purchasing the Lettsworth estate for $1.1 million. This 29-room Tudor Gothic fortress, which the world would come to know simply as the Playboy Mansion West, was sold to the public as the ultimate realization of the American dream, a sun-drenched playground of eternal youth featuring a private zoo, an infamous swimming pool grotto, and a rotating cast of the world's most beautiful women. However, beneath the manicured lawns and the wandering flamingos lay a darker architectural intent. Designed less as a home and more as a sovereign state, the mansion functioned as a fortified compound with its own internal economy, its own laws, and, crucially, its own police force. As the cultural tide turned from the cocktail-sipping hedonism of the 1960s to the cocaine-fueled paranoid frenzy of the 1970s, the estate transformed from a gentleman's club into a high-security containment zone, where the primary objective shifted from the pursuit of pleasure to the management of liability. This new fortress required a defense system far more sophisticated than a few bouncers at the front gate. The mansion operated under a veil of secrecy maintained by a private intelligence agency disguised as a security team. Headed by shadowy figures like Joe Piastro, a man whose role straddled the line between bodyguard and fixer, the security detail at the mansion operated with a specific unspoken protocol that prioritized the preservation of the brand over the safety of the inhabitants. Former staff members and investigative reports have since corroborated a standing order within the estate that in the event of a medical emergency, an overdose, or an assault, the Los Angeles Police Department was never the first call. The first call was always to mansion security. The labyrinthine layout of the estate, with its hidden service entrances, underground tunnels, and secluded guest houses, facilitated a delay that was essential for the sanitization of a crime scene. Before paramedics or police could navigate the winding driveway, the room would be swept, illicit substances flushed, and incriminating evidence removed, ensuring that by the time the authorities arrived, they were walking onto a stage set rather than a crime scene. The necessity of this cleanup crew became grimly apparent in September 1973, when the fantasy of the Playboy lifestyle claimed its first visible casualty. Adrienne Pollack was a 23-year-old Playboy bunny, a young woman who had bought into the promise of glamour and access that employment at the clubs provided. Like many women in Hefner's orbit, she was under immense pressure to maintain a facade of effortless perfection while navigating a nightlife ecosystem that was increasingly fueled by pharmaceuticals. On a Thursday afternoon, Pollack was found dead in an apartment closely linked to the Playboy inner circle, her body cold and her system overwhelmed by a lethal dose of methaqualone, the sedative known on the street as Quaaludes. The official coroner's report listed the death as an accidental overdose, a tragedy of youth and excess, but the timeline of the event raises forensic red flags that point to the interference of the mansion's protection apparatus. Witness accounts and the retrospective analysis of the timeline suggest a disturbing gap between the moment Pollack entered distress and the moment emergency services were contacted. In the frantic, silent minutes that ticked by while a young woman's heart stopped beating, the priority of those present was likely not resuscitation, but the eradication of the stash. A dead bunny was a tragedy that could be spun by the public relations machine, but a dead bunny found amidst a mountain of pills directly linked to the mansion's supply chain was a corporate catastrophe that had to be averted at all costs. The machinery of the empire sprang into action, effectively distancing Hefner from the corpse. The narrative was quickly established. Pollock was a tragic, wayward girl who had fallen victim to the excesses of the era, a solitary figure whose death had nothing to do with the culture of the company that employed her. The PR firewall held, and Hefner remained the benevolent, pipe-smoking father figure, shaking his head at the youth of today while presiding over the very ecosystem that facilitated the flow of the narcotics that killed her. While the death of Adrienne Pollock was a tremor that could be suppressed, the darkness was closing in from the outside. By 1974, the United States government, specifically the Drug Enforcement Administration and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, had initiated a crusade against the Playboy empire. They viewed Hefner not as a publisher or a cultural icon, but as a degenerate who was distributing narcotics on a massive scale and corrupting the moral fabric of the nation. The federal authorities were desperate to pin a charge on him, to drag the king of pop culture out of his castle in handcuffs, but Hefner was insulated by layers of high-priced lawyers, fixers, and a plausible deniability that made him nearly untouchable. Frustrated by their inability to breach the inner sanctum, the federal prosecutors decided to change tactics. If they could not strike the king directly, they would target the gatekeeper. Bobby Arnstein was the perfect target. She was not a playmate, nor was she a disposable bunny. She was the structural integrity of Hugh Hefner's life. As his executive secretary and right-hand woman for over a decade, Arnstein managed his schedule, his finances, his correspondence, and his secrets. She was arguably the only woman Hefner viewed with a degree of intellectual respect, often referring to her as his best friend, a title he rarely bestowed upon the rotating cast of lovers who shared his bed. She knew where every skeleton was buried, who was on the payroll, and how the intricate machinery of the mansion operated. The federal strategy was brutal in its simplicity. Break the secretary, and the boss will fall. In early 1974, Bobby Arnstein was arrested outside the mansion by federal agents and charged with conspiracy to distribute cocaine. The arrest was a targeted hit. While she was indeed found with a small quantity of the drug, the scale of the operation launched against her was disproportionate to the crime, clearly indicating that she was merely a pawn in a larger game. The prosecutors squeezed her with terrifying force, threatening her with a draconian prison sentence of 15 years for a first-time offense. The deal they offered was implicit but clear. The heavy sentence would evaporate if she agreed to wear a wire, return to the mansion, and entrap Hugh Hefner in a drug transaction. They wanted her to testify that the man she idolized was the kingpin of a cocaine ring operating out of the Holmby Hills estate. This ultimatum placed Arnstein in a psychological vice grip from which there was no escape. On one side lay the terrifying prospect of losing her freedom, her reputation, and her future in a federal penitentiary. On the other lay the betrayal of the man who had given her a life of purpose, glamour, and proximity to power. The tragedy of Bobby Arnstein was that her loyalty was absolute, a trait that the federal agents underestimated and that Hefner ultimately exploited. As the legal pressure mounted, the atmosphere inside the mansion turned poisonous. The fun that characterized the early 70s evaporated, replaced by a thick fog of paranoia. Hefner, terrified that the investigation would breach his walls, began to distance himself from the woman who had served him faithfully for years. Arnstein, once the gatekeeper of the realm, suddenly found herself radioactive. She was banned from the upper floors of the mansion, excluded from the inner circle, and treated with a cold suspicion by the very family she had dedicated her life to protecting. The isolation was total. Arnstein was left to navigate the terror of the federal indictment alone, watching as the man she was protecting withdrew his emotional support to save his own skin. She was trapped in a vacuum of silence, squeezed between the relentless aggression of the U.S. Attorney's Office and the icy indifference of the Playboy hierarchy. By January 1975, the pressure became terminal. Realizing that she could not bring herself to betray Hefner and unable to face the prospect of a decade behind bars, Bobby Arnstein checked into the Maryland Hotel in Chicago. She was alone in a generic room, miles away from the velvet luxury of the world she helped build. The loyalty that had defined her life had become her death sentence. In the solitude of that hotel room, Arnstein wrote a suicide note that is heartbreaking in its clarity and chilling in its devotion. Even in the face of death, her primary concern was the protection of the brand. She absolved Hefner of any wrongdoing, writing with a tragic finality, "Hugh Hefner is a dedicated, just, and good man." She denied that he had any involvement in the drug trade, effectively using her last words to reinforce the firewall around her boss. She then swallowed a lethal cocktail of drugs, ending her life to stop the investigation. The reaction of Hugh Hefner to the suicide of his best friend provides the most chilling insight into his psyche since the purchase of the crypt next to Marilyn Monroe, stripping away the benevolent mask to reveal the cold calculator beneath. A normal human response to the suicide of a close confidant, especially one driven to death by an investigation targeting you, would be grief, silence, and deep introspection. Hefner chose a different path. He called a press conference. Standing at a podium in a room packed with reporters, flashbulbs popping in his face, Hefner did not look like a broken man mourning a sister. He looked like a CEO managing a crisis. He used the death of Bobby Arnstein not to honor her memory, but to launch a political counterattack against the government. He spun the narrative with masterful manipulation, painting himself as the victim of a puritanical witch hunt and Arnstein as a casualty of the state's overreach. "They murdered her," he declared, framing the tragedy as a chapter in the heroic struggle of Hugh Hefner against the establishment. While there was validity to his accusations of government misconduct, the forensic selfishness of the act was staggering. He turned her fresh corpse into a political prop, absorbing the media attention and centering the narrative on his own persecution. There was no admission of the drug culture that pervaded his home, no acknowledgement that his own lifestyle had placed her in the crosshairs, and no recognition that his withdrawal of support had pushed her over the edge. There was only the Playboy defending his territory, using the body of his loyal servant as a shield. The death of Bobby Arnstein marked the definitive end of the innocent era of Playboy. The suicide proved that the mansion was not a sanctuary from the world, but a pressure cooker that consumed its inhabitants. Forensic analysis of the mid-70s period reveals a significant shift in the internal dynamics of the estate following this event. Paranoia became the dominant emotion. The open-door policy for celebrities was tightened, the security team became more aggressive, and the presence of hard drugs, specifically cocaine, moved from being a dirty secret to being the primary currency of the realm. The disco era at the mansion was characterized by a manic, chemically induced energy, where the laughter was loud but brittle, and the eyes of the guests were wide with artificial stimulation. With the death of his trusted gatekeeper, Hefner became more isolated, more controlling, and more dependent on a new method of compliance. He realized that loyalty, like Bobby's, was fragile and could be broken by external forces. He needed a more reliable way to control the women who lived in his world, a method that didn't rely on their gratitude or their paycheck, but on their chemical dependency and their fear. This shift in strategy set the stage for the next, darker phase of the Playboy curse. The 1980s would bring a new level of depravity where the sophisticated facade would completely crumble to reveal a predatory machine. The cleanup crew had successfully swept the bodies of Adrian Pollock and Bobby Arnstein under the rug, but the rot was spreading in the floorboards. The mansion was about to transform from a party house into a fully operational velvet prison, equipped with the tools of total subjugation, the quaalude, and the video camera. The blood on the disco floor was scrubbed away, but the stain remained, and the man in the silk pajamas was just beginning to perfect the art of the cage. By the late 1970s, the transformation of the Playboy Mansion West was complete. The estate had ceased to be a residence in any conventional sense and had mutated into a fully operational containment facility. To the casual observer reading the magazine or watching the news, the women who lived behind the iron gates were the luckiest in the world, basking in a life of unearned luxury and absolute freedom. However, a forensic examination of the daily protocols enforced by Hugh Hefner reveals a reality that was diametrically opposed to the brand's public image. The mansion was not a palace of liberation. It was a velvet prison, a high-security environment governed by a rigid set of rules designed to strip the inhabitants of their autonomy, their financial independence, and ultimately, their identity. The primary instrument of this control was not physical force, but a sophisticated system of psychological conditioning that began with the clock. The most jarring contradiction to the myth of the wild party lifestyle was the imposition of a draconian curfew. For the women who held the coveted title of girlfriend, a position that was less a romantic partnership and more of a contractual obligation, the gates locked at 9 p.m. This rule was absolute. While Hefner often slept until the afternoon and worked through the night, his possessions were required to be on the premises, accounted for, and waiting for his summon. This curfew served a specific tactical purpose. It severed the women's connections to the outside world. They could not maintain relationships with family. They could not nurture friendships that existed outside the Playboy ecosystem. And, crucially, they could not hold steady jobs. The curfew ensured that their entire existence orbited the gravitational pull of Hugh Hefner. They were kept in a state of suspended animation, preserved like butterflies in a glass case, available solely for his consumption when he descended from his bedroom suite. This temporal control was reinforced by a humiliating system of financial dependency. Despite the immense wealth generated by the Playboy empire, the women who lived in the mansion were not wealthy. They were destitute by design. Hefner did not provide them with access to bank accounts or credit cards. Instead, he utilized an allowance system, reminiscent of a parent controlling a child. The women were given a strictly cash stipend, often as little as $1,000 a week, which sounds generous until the stipulations of the contract are examined. From this money, they were expected to purchase the expensive clothing, lingerie, and beauty treatments required to meet Hefner's impossible aesthetic standards. If a girlfriend wanted to save money to move out or go to school, she found it mathematically impossible. The system was engineered to keep them living hand-to-mouth in a castle, ensuring that leaving the mansion meant stepping into immediate poverty. They were trapped by the very luxury that seduced them. Once the physical and financial perimeters were secured, Hefner initiated a process that psychologists call grooming, but which in the context of the mansion is better described as cloning. The testimony of Sandra Theodore, who became Hefner's girlfriend in 1976 at the age of 19, provides a chilling roadmap of this erasure. When Theodore arrived, she was an individual with her own style and personality. Within months, she was being systematically rewritten. Hefner dictated her appearance with the precision of a factory foreman. He demanded she bleach her hair to a specific shade of platinum blonde, a chemical process so harsh and frequent that her hair began to fall out. He criticized her clothing, replacing her wardrobe with the pastel hyperfeminine aesthetic he preferred. When superficial changes were insufficient, he demanded surgical intervention. The women of the mansion were routinely pressured into cosmetic surgeries, rhinoplasties, breast augmentations, and liposuction, not because they needed them, but because Hefner was trying to mold them into a singular static ideal. He was not dating different women. He was dating the same woman over and over again, using living human beings as raw material to construct a fantasy that existed only in his mind. However, the most insidious mechanism of control in the Playboy arsenal was not financial or aesthetic. It was pharmaceutical. If the 9 p.m. curfew was the bars of the cage, the drug methaqualone was the lock. Known commercially as Quaaludes, these sedatives were the lifeblood of the mansion's sexual economy during the late 70s and early 80s. To the public, Quaaludes were a party drug, a disco biscuit that made you feel loose and euphoric. To Hugh Hefner, they were a tool of compliance. In private, he referred to them with a term that is as grotesque as it is revealing: thigh openers. This terminology destroys any defense of consensual fun. It reveals intent. Hefner viewed the drug as a chemical crowbar, a way to bypass the natural resistance or lack of interest of the women he targeted. The logistics of the drug supply at the mansion suggest a scale of operation that bordered on criminal enterprise. Since Hefner could not legally obtain the thousands of pills required to fuel the mansion's nightlife, he utilized a network of doctors who wrote prescriptions under the names of his staff, including his secretaries and security personnel. The pills were stockpiled in the master suite, dispensed like candy to the young women who entered his orbit. The pharmacological effect of Quaaludes is crucial to understanding the lack of resistance from the victims. A powerful central nervous system depressant, the drug creates a state of dissociation and physical lethargy, often described as jelly legs, while keeping the user conscious. It strips away anxiety and inhibition, but it also strips away the ability to say no. Under the influence of Quaaludes, a woman might be physically awake but psychologically paralyzed, unable to fight back or even process the reality of what was happening to her. This was chemical warfare waged against consent. The devastating effectiveness of this weapon was on full display during the infamous pig nights. Every Thursday, the mansion hosted a ritual that was kept hidden from the glossy pages of the magazine. A select group of Hefner's VIP friends, mostly older, wealthy men, would gather for dinner, after which the girlfriends were expected to entertain them in the bedroom or the grotto. Former residents described these nights less as hedonistic gatherings and more as grueling shift work. The women, often heavily sedated with Quaaludes supplied by Hefner, were passed around like hors d'oeuvres. They were not participants in a sexual revolution. They were service workers in a nightmare, performing acts they found repulsive because their brains were chemically fogged and their livelihoods depended on their compliance. The Quaalude acted as an amnesiac buffer, allowing them to wake up the next morning with only a hazy memory of the violation, making it easier for them to stay and do it all again the next week. But Hefner was not content with merely controlling the present moment through drugs. He wanted to control the future through surveillance. Deep within the architecture of the Mansion West, buried in the walls and hidden behind the stonework of the grotto, was a system that transformed the estate into a panopticon. Long before the era of digital spy cams, Hefner installed a sophisticated network of video recording equipment focused on the areas where sexual activity took place. The master bedroom was rigged with cameras, as was the guest house and the pool area. This was not merely the voyeurism of a dirty old man, it was the accumulation of leverage. For decades, Hefner recorded the sexual acts of his guests and his girlfriends, often without their knowledge or consent. This library of tapes became his ultimate insurance policy. Hollywood stars, famous athletes, and powerful politicians frequented the mansion, indulging in the drug-fueled, quaalude-soaked atmosphere. Hefner captured it all. This collection of compromising material created a force field of silence around the mansion. A celebrity who might have been inclined to speak out about the abuse they witnessed would think twice, knowing that a tape of them in a compromising position existed in Hefner's vault. For the women, the threat was even more immediate. The knowledge that their most intimate drug-induced moments were recorded and archived created a permanent state of anxiety. They knew that if they left, if they spoke to the press, or if they tried to expose the reality of Pig Night, Hefner possessed the power to humiliate them globally. The existence of this surveillance system fundamentally alters the interpretation of the mansion's history. It reframes every interaction as a potential setup. The generosity of Hefner inviting aspiring actresses and models to stay at the mansion was in reality a trap to capture footage that could be used to bind them to him. The power dynamic was absolute. He was the watcher, and they were the watched. He held the tapes, the money, and the drugs. The psychological toll of living in this environment, where one had to look perfect, perform sexually on command, and assume they were being filmed at all times, was catastrophic. It induced a state of learned helplessness, where the victim stopped trying to escape because the walls seemed too high and the reach of the patriarch too long. By the dawn of the 1980s, the machinery of the Playboy cult was running at peak efficiency. The cleanup crew handled the bodies, the doctors handled the prescriptions, and the cameras handled the silence. The women who walked the halls were no longer the vibrant, individualistic personalities of the 60s. They were increasingly homogenized, sedated, and terrified. Sandra Theodore, who eventually escaped, described looking into the mirror and not recognizing the platinum blonde staring back at her. She had been hollowed out, filled with chemicals, and reprogrammed to serve the needs of the machine. But while the system seemed invincible from the inside, the human cost was accumulating. The combination of easy access to lethal drugs, the pressure of constant surveillance, and the dehumanization of the grotto culture was creating a pressure cooker that could not be contained forever. The system required a constant influx of fresh innocence to consume, and in 1980, it would find its most tragic victim, a young woman whose destruction would expose the grotesque heart of the empire and leave a stain of blood that no amount of PR spin could ever wash away. The stage was set for the martyrdom of Dorothy Stratton. From the murder of Dorothy Stratton to the collapse of the dynasty. If the Playboy Mansion was a factory, its product was the Playmate. For decades, the machinery described in the previous chapters, the grooming, the chemical coercion, the psychological isolation, churned out hundreds of interchangeable fantasies. They were manufactured to be beautiful, compliant, and temporary. But in 1979, the machine produced something different. It produced a woman who was so radiantly perfect, so terrifyingly innocent, that she threatened to transcend the disposable nature of the brand. Her name was Dorothy Stratton, and she was not merely a centerfold. She was the Messiah the empire had been waiting for. Her subsequent destruction in a grime-stained apartment in West Los Angeles serves as the definitive forensic indictment of Hugh Hefner's philosophy. It proved that in the Playboy ecosystem, a woman's value is inextricably linked to her possession by a man, and when that possession is challenged, the result is annihilation. The trajectory of Dorothy Stratton is the heartbreaking inverse of the American dream. Born in a poverty-stricken corner of Vancouver, Canada, she was working behind the counter of a Dairy Queen when she was discovered. She was 18 years old, painfully shy, and possessed a luminous, ethereal beauty that seemed almost out of place in the harsh, fluorescent light of a fast food kitchen. To forensic psychologists, her profile was the perfect storm of vulnerability. She had no father figure, no money, and a desperate, naive desire to be loved. She was a blank canvas waiting for an artist, but instead, she was found by a predator. Paul Snider was a small-time hustler, a pimp in polyester, who prowled the fringes of the Vancouver nightlife. He was everything Hugh Hefner was not, tacky, loud, and visibly desperate. Yet forensically, they were identical twins, separated by class. Both men viewed women as currency. Snider saw Dorothy not as a person, but as a winning lottery ticket. He courted her with cheap jewelry and grand promises, quickly maneuvering himself into the role of her manager, her lover, and her controller. He groomed her, convinced her to pose for unclothed photos, and sent them to Playboy magazine in Chicago. When the photos landed on Hugh Hefner's desk, the reaction was immediate. Hefner, a man who had reviewed tens of thousands of centerfold candidates, recognized that Stratton was a singularity. She was the girl next door archetype perfected. She was flown to Los Angeles, and the machinery of the empire instantly enveloped her. She was fast-tracked through the system, bypassing the usual hierarchy, to become Miss August 1979 and inevitably the Playmate of the Year for 1980. For a brief, shining moment, the fantasy seemed real. Dorothy Stratton became the face of Playboy. She worked as a bunny at the Century City Club. She lived at the mansion, and she sat by Hefner's side during movie nights. To Hefner, she was the ultimate validation of his life's work. She was living proof that a girl from nowhere could be elevated to royalty through the transformative power of his magazine. He treated her with a possessive fondness, regarding her as the crown jewel of his collection. But while Hefner polished the jewel, he ignored the rot that had come attached to it. He allowed Paul Snider into the fold. This decision is the nexus of Hefner's moral culpability. Snider moved to Los Angeles with Dorothy, riding her coattails into the mansion. He was an anomaly in the VIP section, a pimp wearing mink coats and driving a customized limousine with vanity plates that read Star 80. The elites of Hollywood and the mansion staff despised him. They saw him for what he was, a parasite. Hefner found him distasteful, a punk who didn't fit the sophisticated aesthetic of the brand. Yet, he tolerated him. He allowed Snider access to the grounds, to the parties, and to the women. He did this because Snider was the handler of his favorite asset. As long as Dorothy was happy and compliant, the parasite was allowed to feed. This tolerance legitimized Snider. It fed his delusion that he was a player, a man of consequence, rather than just a pimp who had gotten lucky. However, the Playboy curse is fueled by the inevitability of change. Dorothy Stratton began to grow. The very exposure that Snider and Hefner had engineered for her opened doors they could not close. She began to attract the attention of legitimate Hollywood power players, specifically the director Peter Bogdanovich. Bogdanovich was cast in the role of the savior, the man who saw Dorothy's soul rather than just her body. He cast her in a major studio film. They all laughed and fell deeply in love with her. He told her she was an actress, an artist, a human being. For the first time in her life, Dorothy Stratton was being looked at, not through. This awakening triggered a catastrophic collapse in the control structures of the two men who owned her. For Paul Snider, the rise of Dorothy Stratton was a death sentence for his ego. He realized that she was outgrowing him. She was moving into a stratosphere of celebrity where a pimp from Vancouver could not follow. He became paranoid, hiring private investigators to track her, tapping her phone lines, and purchasing a shotgun. For Hugh Hefner, the threat was more subtle but equally unacceptable. Dorothy's relationship with Bogdanovich threatened to remove the crown jewel from the mansion. If she became a serious actress, she would no longer be a playmate. She would be an individual. In the summer of 1980, the tension reached a breaking point. Dorothy, emboldened by Bogdanovich's love, mustered the courage to leave Snider. She moved out of the apartment they shared and into Bogdanovich's home. It was an act of supreme bravery for a girl who'd been conditioned to be submissive. The reaction of the two patriarchs was telling. Snider disintegrated. He spent his days in a dark rented house in West Los Angeles, consuming massive amounts of cocaine and nursing a grievance that was festering into a homicidal rage. Hefner, on the other hand, simply excommunicated the problem. When Snider's behavior became erratic, Hefner banned him from the mansion. This is often cited by Playboy apologists as evidence of Hefner's concern, but forensic analysis suggests it was merely image management. He didn't ban Snider to protect Dorothy. He banned him because Snider had become an embarrassment. Hefner washed his hands of the situation, leaving a 20-year-old girl to navigate the dissolution of a marriage to a violent, unstable predator alone. He had the resources to protect her, the security team that specialized in cleaning up messes, but he did not deploy them. Dorothy was leaving the fold, and therefore she was no longer entitled to the fortress's protection. On August 14, 1980, the tragedy reached its terminal velocity. Dorothy Stratton agreed to meet Paul Snider one last time at the rented house on South Doheny Drive. She went to negotiate a financial settlement for their divorce. She believed, with the heartbreaking naivety that defined her short life, that she could reason with him. She believed that if she gave him enough money, he would let her go. She drove there alone in her Chevrolet Sprint. She walked through the front door just after noon. She never walked out. The crime scene discovered later that night by Snider's roommates is one of the most gruesome in the history of Los Angeles, not just for the violence, but for the specific ritualistic nature of the violation. It was a tableau of absolute objectification. Forensic reconstruction reveals that Snider murdered Dorothy shortly after she arrived. He used a 12-gauge Mossberg shotgun. He did not shoot her in the face, he shot her in the head from behind, preserving the beauty that was her only currency. Death was instantaneous, but the horror did not end with the gunshot. What followed was an act that transforms this from a murder into a forensic manifesto of the Playboy philosophy, taken to its logical, psychotic extreme. After Dorothy Stratton was dead, Paul Snider assaulted her corpse. He arranged her body on a bondage machine he had built, a device designed to restrain a woman in a posture of submission. He then desecrated her remains in a final act of possessive madness. This act of post-mortem violation is difficult to process, but it is essential to the autopsy of the Playboy culture. Why would a man do this? Psychologists argue that for a man like Snider, and by extension, the culture that created him, the ultimate fantasy is a woman who cannot say no, who cannot leave, who cannot have an opinion, and who exists solely as a vessel for male gratification. A dead woman is the perfect playmate. She is eternally young, eternally silent, and eternally compliant. In his drug-fueled madness, Snider was enacting the darkest subtext of the magazine, total possession. After he had finished with her, he turned the shotgun on himself. When the police broke down the door hours later, they found the bodies. The walls were splattered with blood. The air smelled of cordite and death. The girl next door, the face of a billion-dollar empire, was reduced to forensic evidence in a rented room. The shock wave of the murder hit Los Angeles with the force of an earthquake. But the epicenter of the reaction, the Playboy mansion, remained strangely insulated. The behavior of Hugh Hefner in the hours and days following the death of his beloved creation was a masterclass in narcissistic detachment. Hefner did not rush to the scene. He did not publicly weep for the loss of a human life. Instead, the Playboy PR machine went into overdrive. The narrative was immediately constructed. Paul Snider was a monster, a crazy outsider who had infiltrated the world of beauty and destroyed it. Hefner positioned himself as the grieving father figure, another victim of Snider's madness. He told the press, "I was shocked. I knew Paul was a little crazy, but I never thought he was capable of this." This statement was a lie of omission. Everyone knew Snider was dangerous. Everyone knew he was armed. But acknowledging that would mean acknowledging that the Playboy ecosystem attracted and empowered men like Snider. It would mean admitting that the line between the sophisticated objectification practiced by Hefner and the brutal objectification practiced by Snider was thinner than a sheet of paper. Hefner did not attend Dorothy Stratton's funeral. He claimed he was advised against it to avoid a media circus, but insiders suggest a colder reason. He could not bear to be in a room where he was not the center of attention, or perhaps he could not face the accusation in the eyes of Peter Bogdanovich. Bogdanovich publicly blamed Hefner for the murder, stating that the Playboy sex factory was directly responsible for creating the environment where Dorothy could be treated as a disposable commodity. He argued that Playboy taught men like Snider that women were objects to be owned, and when Snider lost ownership, he destroyed the object so no one else could have it. The aftermath of Dorothy Stratton's death was the moment the innocence of Playboy officially died. Before 1980, the brand could still pretend to be about harmless fun, about a liberated lifestyle. After 1980, it was stained with blood. The image of the Playmate was no longer just a smiling girl in a bikini. It was haunted by the ghost of the girl who was tied to a bondage bench and blasted with a shotgun. Yet the most infuriating aspect of the tragedy is how the empire metabolized it. In the years that followed, Playboy didn't hide from the Stratton story. They commodified it. The tragedy became part of the lore, a dark legend that added a frisson of danger to the mansion. Hefner continued to speak of her wistfully, rewriting history to make himself the hero who tried to save her. He never acknowledged the fundamental truth, that Dorothy Stratton was groomed by Snider to be sold to Hefner, and when she tried to break the contract of sale, the transaction was voided with a bullet. The death of Dorothy Stratton was not an anomaly. It was a systemic failure. It demonstrated that the velvet prison was not designed to keep the world out. It was designed to keep the women in. And when a woman tried to escape the gravity of the planet Playboy, the consequences were terminal. The machine had malfunctioned and crushed its most beautiful creation, but the gears didn't stop turning. They just needed to be wiped clean. Hefner grieved for a moment and then he went back to work. There was a new month coming and he needed a new centerfold. The show, as they say, had to go on even if the star was dead. By the turn of the millennium, the Playboy empire was medically dead. The cultural revolution it claimed to lead had moved on decades prior, leaving the magazine as a relic of a bygone era, gathering dust on newsstand shelves alongside other artifacts of the mid-century. The internet had democratized pornography, offering for free in seconds what Hugh Hefner was still trying to sell for $6 a month. The circulation numbers were in free fall, the stock price was hemorrhaging, and the brand was viewed by the new generation not as dangerous or sexy, but as grandfatherly and irrelevant. However, just as the flat line seemed permanent, the empire was jolted back to life by a powerful injection of adrenaline: reality television. The premiere of The Girls Next Door in 2005 on E! Entertainment Television was a masterstroke of propaganda. For 6 seasons, cameras beamed a high-definition fairy tale into millions of living rooms across the world. The show depicted life at the Playboy Mansion as a whimsical, harmless sorority house where 3 beautiful young women, Holly Madison, Bridget Marquardt, and Kendra Wilkinson, lived in a state of perpetual joy under the benevolent, eccentric care of an 80-year-old Hugh Hefner. The editing was bright, the music was bouncy, and the narrative was carefully curated to present the mansion as the ultimate sanctuary of fun. But if one were to turn off the studio lights and subject the footage to a forensic audit, the picture would dissolve into something far more grotesque. The reality show was a digital mask placed over a rotting corpse. The physical condition of the Playboy Mansion West during the 2000s provides the most damning evidence of the empire's internal decay. While the television cameras utilized soft lighting and strategic angles to maintain the illusion of opulence, the estate itself had deteriorated into a squalid health hazard. Visitors who were not on the payroll frequently reported a sensory shock the moment they stepped through the heavy oak doors. The smell. The mansion did not smell of expensive perfume or mahogany. It smelled of animal waste and mildew. Hefner, whose need for control paradoxically coexisted with a complete lack of discipline, allowed a pack of dogs to roam the house freely. These animals were not house-trained. They relieved themselves on the priceless Persian rugs, the curtains, and the furniture. Over years of neglect, the ammonia stench of urine had seeped into the very floorboards of the great hall, masked only by the heavy application of baby oil and industrial air fresheners. This filth was not confined to the common areas. The master bedroom, the epicenter of the sexual revolution, had become the lair of a hoarder. Hefner, trapped in the amber of his own past, refused to throw anything away. His suite was cluttered with towering piles of VHS tapes, unread newspapers from decades past, and memorabilia that collected layers of dust. The windows were permanently blacked out, creating a timeless, suffocating tomb where the air was stale and the hygiene was questionable. The luxury was a set piece. The reality was a dirty, crumbling frat house run by a geriatric recluse who refused to pay for renovations because he was bleeding money. The velvet ropes were fraying, the stone facade was cracking, and the water in the grotto, once the site of legendary parties, was a bacterial soup that health officials would later identify as the source of Legionnaire's disease outbreaks. Into this decaying orbit stepped Holly Madison, the woman who would become the #1 girlfriend and the central figure of the reality show era. On screen, Madison was the perfect protagonist, bubbly, devoted to Puffin, her pet name for Hefner, and living a dream life. Off-screen, her existence was a psychological horror story that echoed the tragic trajectory of Bobby Arnstein, albeit with a modern twist. Madison was not battling federal agents. She was battling a sophisticated campaign of emotional abuse designed to shatter her self-esteem. Hefner, now an octogenarian, had refined his methods of control. He no longer needed physical walls. He built prisons out of words. Forensic analysis of Madison's time in the mansion reveals a pattern of systematic degradation. Hefner, despite being old enough to be her great-grandfather, preyed on her insecurities with the cruelty of a high school bully. He frequently criticized her appearance, telling her she looked old, hard, and cheap if she wore red lipstick or cut her hair without his permission. He pitted the girlfriends against each other, creating a triangular toxic environment where they competed for his limited affection and resources. Madison, who had entered the mansion with hopes of a career in security, found herself trapped in a cycle of dependency. She was isolated from her family, financially reliant on the weekly allowance that came with strict conditions, and terrified of the world outside the gates. The psychological toll was nearly fatal. In a moment that mirrors the darkest days of the 1970s, Madison admitted to lying in the bathtub of the master suite, staring at the ceiling and contemplating drowning herself. She felt she had no way out. The public perceived her as a celebrity, but in reality she was a prisoner in a gilded cage who had to ask permission to go to the grocery store. The ghost of the mansion was not supernatural. It was the recurring despair of the women who realized too late that the price of admission was their soul. The lie of the sex life at the mansion was perhaps the most pathetic element of the entire charade. The reality show hinted at a vibrant, active bedroom life, maintaining the myth of Hefner's virility. The truth was a grim mechanical ritual that took place every Wednesday and Friday night after the club visits. There was no romance, no seduction, and certainly no passion. It was a scheduled performance. The girlfriends, often joined by recruiters, fresh women brought in to spice up the night, would gather in the bedroom. Hefner, fueled by Viagra, a drug that replaced the Quaaludes of the 70s as the chemical enabler of the regime, would lie on the bed while the women performed acts on him that were purely transactional. Witness accounts describe these encounters as chores. The women would watch the clock, waiting for it to be over, while the man who claimed to be the world's greatest lover lay passive, consuming their youth to sustain his own ego. It was not an orgy. It was a medical procedure. The use of Viagra allowed the machinery to keep running long after the biology had failed, a fitting metaphor for the entire Playboy brand in the 21st century. The sex was dead, but the corpse was being propped up by chemicals and contracts. While the bedroom was a site of emotional stagnation, the boardroom was a scene of financial carnage. Christy Hefner, Hugh's daughter and the CEO of Playboy Enterprises, spent this decade engaged in a desperate, futile struggle to keep the Titanic afloat. She was the grown-up in the room, a sharp, capable executive who understood that the business model was broken. She attempted to pivot the company, to modernize it, to close the money-losing clubs and focus on digital licensing. However, she was constantly sabotaged by the chairman himself. Hugh Hefner refused to accept the reality of the balance sheet. He demanded the continued funding of his lavish lifestyle, the upkeep of the mansion, the private chefs and the parties, even as the company laid off staff and the stock price plummeted toward penny stock territory. The tension between father and daughter was the conflict between delusion and reality. Christy was trying to run a public company. Hugh was running a cult of personality. He treated the corporate treasury as his personal piggy bank, oblivious to the fact that he was spending the inheritance of his children and the pensions of his employees on a fantasy that no longer existed. In 2009, Christy Hefner finally resigned. Her departure was a signal flare to Wall Street that the ship was going down. The woman who had spent 20 years cleaning up her father's messes finally walked away, leaving the old man alone in his crumbling castle with his paid companions and his failing organs. The inevitable end of The Girls Next Door marked the shattering of the final illusion. When Holly Madison finally mustered the courage to leave in 2008, The facade crumbled instantly. Hefner didn't mourn the loss of a relationship. He panicked at the loss of a cast member. He immediately replaced her with two indistinguishable blonde twins, the Shannon sisters, and another young woman, Crystal Harris, in a desperate attempt to keep the reality show renewals coming. But the magic was gone. The audience had seen the cracks. The stories emerging from the ex-girlfriends were no longer about fun and frolics. They were about manipulation, depression, and the sheer overwhelming stink of the place. By 2010, the Playboy Mansion West stood as a monument to denial. It was a house of cards held together by duct tape and NDA agreements. The king was frail, hard of hearing, and increasingly disoriented. Yet he still sat at the head of the dining table, demanding his pot roast and his scheduled sex, surrounded by women who were young enough to be his great-granddaughters and who viewed him with a mix of pity and opportunism. The cameras had turned off, and the silence that returned to the Holmby Hills estate was heavy with the weight of 60 years of exploitation. The party was officially over, but the bill was about to come due. The final chapter would not be written in the magazine, but in the obituary columns and the bankruptcy courts, as the biological death of the founder finally caught up with the moral death of his creation. The end of the Playboy empire did not arrive with the cinematic grandeur that Hugh Hefner had scripted for himself. There was no final glamorous party, no gathering of the cultural elite to pay homage to a revolutionary. Instead, the king of sex died as he had lived in his final years, isolated, delusional, and surrounded by the physical manifestations of his own decay. On September 27, 2017, inside the master suite of the Playboy Mansion, the 91-year-old patriarch took his final breath. The official cause of death listed on the coroner's report was cardiac arrest and respiratory failure, but the secondary causes, sepsis and an E. coli infection, tell a more forensic, ironic story. The man who built a brand on the concept of pristine airbrushed perfection ultimately succumbed to a bacterial infection bred in filth. The cleanup crew could scrub the crime scenes of the 1970s, but they could not scrub the microscopic rot that had permeated the mansion's very infrastructure. Hefner died of the swamp he refused to drain. In the days leading up to his death, the reality of the mansion was a grim parody of its golden era. Hefner was no longer the silk-robed Lothario. He was a frail invalid weighing barely 90 pounds, deaf, and reliant on a walker to navigate the clutter of his hoarding. His world had shrunk to the size of his bedroom, a space with blacked-out windows where day and night were indistinguishable. His final companion, his third wife, Crystal Harris, a woman 60 years his junior, was often absent, traveling the world on his dime while he withered away. Their marriage was the ultimate transactional relationship of his life, a contract signed in the ink of desperation. He needed a nurse who looked like a playmate, and she needed the security of the Hefner name. When the end came, there were no tears of lost love. There was only the quiet hum of medical equipment and the shuffling of staff preparing for the inevitable transition of power. However, the death of Hugh Hefner was not a tragedy for the women of the Playboy empire. It was a liberation event. For decades, a force field of fear had silenced the victims of the mansion. This silence was enforced by a complex web of non-disclosure agreements, NDAs, the threat of litigation, and the terrifying social power Hefner wielded in Hollywood. As long as the wolf was alive, the sheep were too terrified to bleat. But the moment his heart stopped, the spell broke. The NDAs lost their teeth. The fear evaporated. The death of the dictator signaled the beginning of the reckoning. The floodgates opened slowly at first, then with the force of a dam breaking. The catalyst was the 2022 A&E documentary series Secrets of Playboy, which functioned less as a retrospective and more as a posthumous tribunal. Women who had been marginalized, dismissed as crazy, or erased from history suddenly stepped into the light. Sandra Theodore, the girlfriend from the late 70s, detailed the grooming and the bestiality. Holly Madison dissected the emotional torture of the 2000s. Jennifer Saganor, who grew up on the property as the daughter of Hefner's personal physician, exposed the normalization of pedophilia and the way young girls were viewed as fresh meat for the uncles who visited the estate. The testimony was consistent, corroborating the forensic patterns we have analyzed throughout this series. They spoke of the leg spreader quaaludes. They spoke of the pig nights. They spoke of the video cameras hidden in the bedroom walls. Perhaps the most damning revelation was the confirmed existence of the dumping of the tapes. According to insider testimony, shortly before or immediately after Hefner's death, loyalists within the organization gathered the thousands of hours of illicitly recorded sexual footage, the compromat, collected over 40 years, and disposed of it in the Pacific Ocean. This was not an act of privacy protection. It was the final destruction of evidence by a criminal conspiracy. They knew that if those tapes were ever subpoenaed, the legacy of Hugh Hefner would shift from eccentric publisher to prolific sex offender overnight. While the victims were dismantling Hefner's moral legacy, the financial markets were dismantling his corporate legacy. The collapse of the Playboy business dynasty in the wake of his death was swift and brutal. Cooper Hefner, Hugh's youngest son and the designated heir, attempted to take the reins. He was a tragic figure in the final act, a young man who genuinely believed in the philosophy his father had sold him, unaware that the philosophy was a lie. Cooper tried to modernize the brand, to make it woke, to distance it from the nudity and the misogyny. But he was trying to renovate a building that was structurally unsound. The rot was too deep. The private equity firms and the board of directors, no longer beholden to the whims of the founder, staged a coup. They recognized that for the brand to survive in the #MeToo era, the man who created it had to be exorcised. In a move that would have destroyed Hefner's ego more than prison, the company he founded, now rebranded as the PLBY Group, issued a statement that effectively disowned him. The Hefner family is no longer associated with Playboy, the press release read. They publicly denounced his actions, stating that his behavior was abhorrent and antithetical to their values. It was the ultimate corporate patricide. The rabbit head logo remained, but the Hefner dynasty was effectively extinguished. The man who drew it was erased from the company stationery. The empire survived by cannibalizing its emperor. The final physical erasure took place at 10,236 Charing Cross Road. The Playboy Mansion West, the Vatican of this dark religion, was sold to Darren Metropolis, the billionaire heir to the hostess fortune who lived next door. The sale came with a macabre condition. Hefner was allowed to live there until he died. Once the body was removed, the demolition began. Metropolis did not treat the mansion as a historical landmark. He treated it as a teardown. Construction crews moved in and gutted the property. The infamous grotto, the site of countless alleged assaults and the breeding ground for the E. coli that helped kill Hefner, was jackhammered into rubble. The shag carpets soaked in dog urine were ripped out. The blacked-out windows were smashed to let in the light. The secret passageways were exposed and sealed. The velvet prison was stripped down to its studs. Today, the location is merely a piece of high-value real estate in Holmby Hills. The ghosts have been evicted, and the physical evidence of the crimes has been hauled away in dumpsters. So, what is the final verdict on the Playboy curse? For 60 years, Hugh Hefner sold the world a story. He told us he was a liberator. He told us he was fighting for freedom of speech, for civil rights, for the sexual emancipation of men and women. He wrapped his hedonism in the American flag and called it patriotism. But the autopsy of his life reveals that this was the longest and most successful con game in American history. Hefner was never truly a revolutionary. He was merely a trauma response mechanism masquerading as a man. He was the affectionless child from Chicago who built a fortress to keep the world out. He was the predator who bought the rights to a dead woman's body to launch his career. He was the cult leader who used drugs and surgery to mold teenagers into dolls. He was the narcissist who stood over the bodies of Adrian Pollock, Bobby Arnstein, and Dorothy Stratton, and worried only about his press coverage. The Playboy lifestyle was a pyramid scheme of misery. At the top, one man lived in luxury. At the bottom, thousands of women paid the price with their bodies, their mental health, and their lives. The freedom he offered was conditional on total submission. The sexual revolution he preached was strictly for the benefit of men. For the women, it was just unpaid labor in a silk-lined factory. In the end, Hugh Hefner got exactly what he paid for. He lies today in the crypt at Westwood Village Memorial Park, eternally beside Marilyn Monroe. He thought this would be his final victory, a permanent claim on the ultimate symbol of desire. But forensic history has a different interpretation. He is lying next to a woman who never knew him, never wanted him, and whose tragic exploitation started his clock. It is not a romantic image. It is a crime scene photo frozen in marble. The Playboy empire is dead. The magazines are gone. The clubs are closed. The mansion is gutted. All that remains is the trauma of the survivors and the cold, hard truth that has finally surfaced from the bottom of the grotto. The curse is broken, not because the spell was lifted, but because the victims finally found their voices and screamed the house down.